In this lab, we'll use the virtual BIOS within Microsoft Virtual PC to make some configuration changes and allow you to secure that virtual BIOS. First step is to download and install Microsoft Virtual PC 2007. You could just do a search if you wish. Just do a search for Microsoft Virtual PC. Just make sure that you're downloading version 2007. That's what we're using for this lab. So second step is to run the Virtual PC program, and this should display the Virtual PC console just like you see here. I already have some virtual machines set up, Linux, Windows Vista, etc., but we're going to make a new one. So step 3 is to create a new virtual machine. So in the Virtual PC console, we're going to click the New button, and that's going to bring up the Welcome to the New Virtual Machine Wizard window. We'll click Next for that, and we're going to leave it as Create a Virtual Machine. Click Next, and then you can name the virtual machine and choose where you want to store it. By default, it stores it in the My Virtual Machines folder. You might not want to do that. That's up to you. You can always change the path. That's up to you. But what we're going to do now is we're going to name it BIOS Test, and we'll click Next. Then it asks you for an operating system. Well, Virtual PC, you can install all kinds of operating systems, but we're just going to leave it as Other because we're not actually installing an OS. We're just working with the BIOS. So we'll leave this as Other and click Next. And we're going to leave the recommended RAM, which is 128 megabytes. We hardly need any RAM to get into the BIOS of a virtual machine. So we'll leave that as is and click Next. And then it asks about virtual hard disks. Well, you'll probably want to make a new virtual hard disk, especially if this is the first virtual machine you're making on this computer. So we'll click the radio button for New Virtual Hard Disks, and we'll click Next. And again, you can store this where you want. I'm going to leave it as the default and leave the default hard disk size, which is 16 gig, which is plenty big enough. Again, we're not installing an OS, just working with the BIOS. We'll click Next. And you want to check over your results here, your information actually, before you finish, and make sure everything's correct. We'll click the Finish button, and that creates the new virtual machine. It's not running yet, hasn't run as of yet. But now your virtual machine, or VM, is created. So we'll move on to step 4, and that's to access the virtual machine's BIOS. Now, when we start up the virtual machine, you won't have much time to get into the BIOS. And the key you want to press is the Delete key. That's the default key within Virtual PC to access the BIOS. You can start up the virtual machine by double-clicking it, or by highlighting it and going to Start. That'll bring up the virtual machine window, and you can see it already went through the BIOS, the setup screen, and now it's trying to boot off of a DHCP server and get information across the network. Well, we don't want that. We just want to get into the BIOS. So if you miss the BIOS setup screen, just go to Action, Reset, and be ready to press that Delete key. We'll click Reset, and here press Delete. And if you miss it again like I did, just do it one more time. Again, you only get about a second or so to get into that BIOS utility. But once you get in, you should see the BIOS setup utility screen. And note that your mouse will not work here, only the keyboard will work. So we're going to be using the arrow keys, Enter key, Escape key, that kind of thing. So now let's go ahead and secure the BIOS. And we're just going to show some basic BIOS security options. Step 5 is change the boot device priority order. To do that, we're going to arrow over to the boot menu, and you'll see that boot device priority is already highlighted. We're going to press Enter to select that, and you'll see the boot device priority order right here. Basically what the virtual machine is going to do is it's going to try to boot off of the floppy drive, if you have one. If there's nothing there, it'll move on to the CD-ROM drive, and then finally to the hard drive. Well, this is rather insecure. Most computers in a network should be set up as hard drive first. This eliminates the ability for a user to boot off of any removable media. So we're going to use the plus sign to move these around until we get hard drive first. And for the rest of them, it doesn't really matter to me. You could have it in whatever order you want, but this will be a pretty common order. Hard drive will be first. If there's an operating system, it'll boot it. Second is the network card. So if there is no operating system, the system will try to get an image of an operating system from over the network. So there you have it. We've changed the boot device priority. And now we'll move on to the next step. Next is we want to disable the floppy disk drive, if you have one, of course. Usually you want to disable removable media, floppy drives, maybe even CD-ROM access, USB devices, external SATA, that kind of thing. So just as an example, we'll disable the floppy drive, and to do so we'll press the escape key. That'll bring us back to the main menu. And we're going to arrow over to the advanced menu and arrow down to floppy configuration. Once that's highlighted, we'll press enter, and that brings up the floppy configuration screen. And you can see here floppy A is showing as a old school 1.44 megabyte 3.5 inch floppy drive. I don't really have a floppy drive on this computer, but if you did and your policies for your company specified to disable it, this is where you would go. To do so, we'll just press enter and then arrow up to disabled. Press enter again, and there you have it. We've disabled the floppy drive. Step 7 is configure a complex supervisor password. This is extremely important. To do so, we're going to press escape to go back to the main menu. We'll arrow over to security, and you'll see here there's no supervisor password and there's no user password. Well, generally companies don't use a user password. The users have their login credentials when they get into the operating system. So a user password isn't really necessary, and honestly it's not as strong a security level as your regular login to your operating system. But the supervisor password is a good idea to install on every system in the BIOS. Again, maybe not the strongest type of hashing algorithm used for the supervisor password, but it's better than nothing. So we should use it, and what we want to do is we want to highlight where it says change supervisor password. We'll press enter. We'll enter in a new password. Capital A, capital B, lowercase c, 1, 2, and the pound sign. Now, this particular BIOS, this virtual BIOS within virtual PC, only lets you do 6 characters max, but that's still a pretty good password. If you have uppercase, lowercase, numeric, and symbols, you get a pretty complex password. However, other computers with real BIOS systems, the latest BIOS systems will have longer passwords that you can add in, 8, 10, 12 characters. So I'll press enter to enter the new password, and like with any password change, it'll ask you to confirm that. So type in the same password and press enter. It says password installed. We'll press enter for OK, and it tells us on the top there supervisory password is installed. You can change user level access. You can do a check of the passwords. There's a lot of things you could do from here, but generally the supervisor password is what you want. That's what you want to have installed on all the systems. A lot of companies will have the same supervisor password on all the computers. If this is the case, I recommend changing the password across the board regularly, every month or so if possible. There are some BIOS programs that can be changed remotely. However, this opens up other security precautions that you have to watch out for. But anyways, there's your complex supervisor password. And a lot of the BIOS programs out there will have more security that you can employ. Like I said before, you might be able to disable USB devices or eSATA devices. There's several things that you could do within the BIOS to make it more secure, in more powerful passwords, things of that nature. In addition, if we arrow down to the exit menu, you'll see here we have optimal defaults. Optimal defaults quite often will help the BIOS to run quickly and efficiently and in a secure manner. So you can watch for that as well on most BIOS programs. You may see other security options like hard drive locking passwords and other types of things. Read up on your motherboard manual and see what kind of security you have for your BIOS. Employ as much of it as you can because the BIOS can be an entrance for attackers to your operating system. And when you're finished, return all your virtual BIOS settings to normal and return the BIOS password as well. To do this, we'll go back to the security menu, and you want to go back to change supervisor password. You'll have to enter in the password that you configured before. Once we've typed in the old password, then we can just press enter for the new password, and that'll uninstall it. We'll press enter again, and you see it says not installed. So make sure you put all your settings back to normal when you're done, unless of course you want to have security settings for your virtual PC BIOS. Remember that every virtual machine within the virtual PC console will get its own virtual BIOS, so you can have different settings for each if you wish to.